Welcome to the History in the Shadow. Subscribe our YouTube channel if you like our videos. Thank you. Let's start the main story. My grandfather Derry chapter 1 chapter 1 Wednesday, January 1st, 1868 St. Louis I arose at 6:10. After breakfast received a call from Jos Lathrop and went walking till dinner. After dinner went out with the children Lily D. and Charlie Hand. Went down to the river and saw a large lot of ice floating down. Snowed last eve and turned cold today. The sun came out about 10:00. And it was very pleasant at noon. The moon shone very bright this evening. Aunt E. received her share of callers. I went down to Louis Grotian's and got me a hat box for a hat that I bought a week ago. I have not been the recipient of either a Christmas or New Year's present with the exception of 2.00 from Father. Thursday 2 St. Louis arose at 6 o'clock. I did not have anything in particular to do, so went walking. The weather was very pleasant all day. In the evening I went out to Mr. Crane's for his wife to attend a lecture by J. Goff. It was a good on the subject of curiosity. Diversive fied by witty sayings. He lectures tonight on habit. I drew up a plan for a writing desk. Have not received a letter from Bro. William for a week or more. Goff said that if your back itched it was a sign that butter would be cheap. If a young lady put a piece of bride cake under her pillow she would dream of a man coming. Friday 3 St. Louis I arose at 5:15. Weather very pleasant all day. Did not do anything of consequence today. Auntie wrecked a letter from Father today with 8.00 enclosed for me. Took a good walk. Received quite a lot of presents from Lily Charlie of nuts and other little things. The bridge at this point is progressing finely. Wrote a letter to Willie Plum of Dubuque, Iowa. I went into a carpenter shop and inquired how much it would cost to make my writing desk, 12 inches. High point 8. Deep 12 front. And he said somewhere in the neighborhood of $8. Saturday, January 4th, 1868 St. Louis arose at 5 o'clock. This is the last day of our vacation. I took a walk this morning with the children. I went down to Mr. Crane's for a ham and to the corner of Commercial and Chestnut Streets for one half dozen quails. Bought me an umbrella for 3.00. Then wrote a letter to G. Co. my room-mate at Grinnell. The weather has been very pleasant all day. Went to the Mercantile Library room to have a book renewed for Uncle William read in a pamphlet that although 60 persons die in one and every minute 70 children are brought to life being an increase than decrease in the world. Sunday 5 St. Louis arose at 6 o'clock. Post gave a discourse on the text. It is now high time to awake out our sleep. After dinner went with Jos Lathrop Fred Wislezinus for a walk, visited the cathedral on 3rd and Walnut. This evening heard a lecture by Rev. Burlingame on the principles to be adopted by young men for 1868. It was a well-delivered one and he put forth total abstinence strongly. The weather pleasant. Lara Crane said that I might send home for my writing desk and have it sent in his name, he being a messenger. Monday 6 St. Louis arose at 5 o'clock. Had a very warm pleasant rain before breakfast but towards 9, it turned cold. School commenced today after a vacation of 2 weeks. My lessons all went well. I did not receive my usual Monday letter from Father nor one from Bro. Business not very lively. Brought little Charlie Hand into my room and put him in my bed, but he made such an outlandish noise that I had to take him back. Lara Crane again told me that I might send for my writing desk in his name. Tuesday, January 7th, 1868 St. Louis arose at 5 o'clock. I received a letter from Father this afternoon with the welcome intelligence that he had heard her mother sing, a thing which she had not done for a number of years. Also wrecked my report at school. It was a very good one, I think. Sick. In Latin the highest in the class 92.
Geog. 92.091.
German 100.90.
Spelling 100.098. Deportment 100.100.
Sent for my writing desk today. No letter from Bro. Wednesday 8 St. Louis arose at 5 o'clock. It has been a very cold day. Went to school as usual. Lessons all went off well. Went to prayer meeting this evening. Stone said today that my last monthly report was satisfactory. We will not get any more this term as there is only two more weeks in the regular session. I went around to the carpenter shop on St. Charles Street for a basket of shavings. Mailed a letter to Father One to Will Plum. Jackson gave us 18 lines in Latin, which is a good long lesson. Thursday 9. Sister Helen is 20 years old today. Louis arose at 5 o'clock. Before breakfast the thermometer was 2 degrees above zero. Went to school as usual. Lessons all went off well. Crane and wife were here to dinner today. Went to the prayer meeting this evening. I am invited to call at his, Dr. Post, study tomorrow afternoon at 4:30 to talk with him, Dr. Post, on personal religion. The wind changed in the course of the afternoon and grew warmer. At 6 o'clock it was 13 O's above zero. Another good long lesson in Latin. Friday, January 10th, 1868, St. Louis arose at 5:30. Went to school as usual. Lesson all perfect. Our class, second academic, and the commercial had a spelling match in which ours came out ahead 18 words. This afternoon I went up to Dr. Post's study to converse on personal religion. He advised me to make public confession of Christ at the young people's prayer meeting on Monday and join the church next communion. I also got a tick of shucks at the corner of 10th Washington Avenue, weather pretty cold today. This morning standing 20 above zero. Saturday 11. St. Louis arose at 6 o'clock. Did not do anything of importance this a.m. This afternoon I went out to Mr. Crane's with a letter for Mrs. I. Also tried to skate, but did not succeed very well. Invited to dinner and had a good one too. Stayed till pretty near 7 o'clock and had a very pleasant time. Came home and went to prayer meeting, it being the last one of the week of prayer. Weather pretty cold all day. Sunday 12. St. Louis arose at 6:20. Did not go to SS as usual. I heard a very good discourse both morning and evening by Dr. Weather pretty cold but nothing compared to Iowa. Post's sermon in the evening was on the prodigal son. Text. And when he came to himself. It was the best I ever heard on that subject. Did not go walking today as it was too cold. Monday, January 13th, 1868, St. Louis arose at 5:15. I went to school as usual. Lessons as they are somehow on Monday not quite as good as other days. When I got home I went after a basket of shavings, bought a bottle blacking for Uncle William. I went into the kitchen to fill the water barrel but found that Annie, being anxious to do a favor for me, had filled it. Studies as usual till 9 o'clock, then retired. I am taking German lessons of Hannah Annie and they say that I pronounce very plain, so I will learn very soon. Snowed this evening. Tuesday 14. St. Louis arose at 5:30. At school as usual I asked Mr. Jackson, my Latin teacher, today what he thought about my dropping Latin, taking up some other lang study next term. He said he would not like it at all. He would not care about losing me. Lessons all went off well. Received a letter from home, one from Bro. He has dissolved partnership with Dr. Allen and gone in with another one whom he likes very much. Pretty cold. At home D. 6 below zero. Shoveled snow. Wednesday 15 St. Louis arose at 4:15. Kept my fire all night for the first time. Attended school as usual. Lessons went off very well. Received a letter from Sister Helen, one from H. Weather pleasant today but a little sloppy. Answered 4 letters. I did not go to prayer meeting this evening as we H chapter 2 chapter 2. You have to read but a few of Charles Edward's diary entries for the first half of January to form some quick impressions. First, he is a fellow inclined to note anything with a number attached. The time he arises each morning, the pocket money received from his father in eagerly awaited letters, when he answers those letters, or the dimensions for a writing table he might have built. Second, an even stronger impression is that Charles Edward has a fairly comfortable life, at least as young men's lives go in 1868. He attends the Academy, a preparatory school at Washington University in St. Louis, while boarding with his uncle and aunt. Many other young men, age 17, in that era would be stuck living on a farm with its unceasing chores and manual labor. Charles Edward, in contrast, enjoys plenty of free time. For example, the first entry on January 1st mentions after breakfast his friend Joseph Lathrop came by the house. The two went out walking until dinner, the midday meal, or lunch. No doubt they walked for hours, and the sun finally came out, as the diarist duly notes, at 10 in the morning. They might have spent the hours talking over how their lives were going, current events or sights they saw. Even though Charles Edward has been attending the academy since September 1867, St. Louis still offers much to explore and observe on walks like these. Thus, it is telling on the title page of the diary. He writes in large capital letters, Charles E. Dickinson, Dubuque, Iowa, as if to assert he is of another place, his Iowa hometown. Not surprisingly, each page of his diary is headed St. Louis, as if his stay is not permanent. He will eventually go home. This habit of specifying where he is living is a convention he drops in mid-February, when he might have wished to be elsewhere. That Charles Edward has comfortable lodgings while in preparatory school owes much to his uncle's professional success and social standing in St. William Dickinson, M.D., well-educated with degrees from Dartmouth and Harvard Medical School, 8-11-41, had impressive experience. After medical school, he traveled to Europe and studied ophthalmology in Berlin, 61. He set up an oculist practice in St. Louis, to which he returned after serving as brigade surgeon in the Civil War. His treatment of a gunshot head wound followed by encephalitis is discussed in the encyclopedic The Medical Surgical History of the War of the Rebellion, Volume 1, prepared under the direction of the U.S. Surgeon General Joseph K. Barnes. His practice at 620 Locust Street, what is now part of the tourism sector of downtown St. Louis and about 1/2 mile from the Mississippi River, was advertised as his office and residence, a combined use mentioned in the diary. William Dickinson was a pioneer in ophthalmology. Notably, he was among the first practitioners to restore sight with cataract surgery. As we read the diary entries for the first weeks of January, it is evident they were written after the evening meal, after Charles Edward finished his studies, and before he retired for sleep. Each day's entry has a sequential accounting, written in one go. I emphasize the word accounting. Charles Edward doesn't waste words exploring any personal misgivings or internal conflicts. Rather, it is the time he got up, what the weather was like, how school went, whom he saw, and so on. An exception to such methodical accounting for each day is illustrated by the entry for Thursday the 9th. He notes his sister Helen, presumably back in Dubuque, is 20 years old today. This is an example of Charles Edward writing down in advance birthday reminders for those in the family. He probably made these before that first entry for January 1st. To wit, after 5 months he stopped the daily entries, and birthday reminders for others in his family, June through December, remained, including his own on August 16th. Sadly, and respecting mortality, he also noted would have been years old for his deceased siblings, who not uncommonly died in childhood. Why Charles Edward came to attend a preparatory school in St. Louis is a question with the complication of an intriguing entry on January 4th. He relates, wrote a letter to G.B. Coe, my roommate at Grinnell. That's evidence, with later mentions of Grinnell, that in the 1866-1867 school year, and possibly earlier, he attended a preparatory school similar to the academy at Grinnell College in Iowa, but over 130 miles from his hometown, Dubuque. Did his father, George Lyman Dickinson, a hotel owner in Dubuque, believe private schooling for Charles Edward would best prepare him for college and professional studies? Did George Lyman believe his son would follow in the footsteps of his successful older brother William Pliny, who had joined a dental practice in Joliet, Illinois? I think the answers are yes. But why leave Grinnell for St. Louis and stay with Uncle William and Aunt Evelina? After 150 years, we have little direct evidence to answer the question. We must start with Charles Edward's penciled entries over the course of 5 months in 1868. Some patient historical probing here and there will turn up what existed in St. Louis and elsewhere in that distant year. Then we might reasonably suppose why Grinnell was left for the academy at Washington University in St. Before tackling the difficult question of what brought Charles Edward to St. Louis, we'll first note in these diary entries the evidence of how people interacted and stayed in touch 150 years ago. In the January 1st entry, Charles Edward says he received a call from Joseph Lathrop, his friend. Joseph Lathrop is also 17, and should not be confused with his uncle back in Dubuque, Joseph Lathrop Dickinson. To our modern eye, this entry might suggest a phone call, but no, telephones in the home were at least 50 years away. Thus, people often dropped in to see if you were available. People would make appointments for meeting, but typically they were arranged in advance and face-to-face. For example, when Charles Edward goes to the church prayer meeting on the evening of Thursday, January 9th, he, with characteristic formality, writes he was invited to call at his Dr. Post study tomorrow afternoon at 4:30. Besides face-to-face conversation, the other common way to stay in touch was correspondence. These days, people seldom bother with written letters, preferring phone, text, email, and the like. But in 1868, if one had the education to write, then keeping up on correspondence was the surest way to be in touch with those distant one could not personally visit. On January 6th, Charles Edward notes he didn't receive his usual Monday letter from his father. He also mentions he hasn't received a letter from his older brother William Pliny and adds on the following day, a Tuesday, no letter from bro. William yet. His expectations for correspondence were deserving of his personal output. In the first 15 days of January, he sends out 9 letters. When he does get a letter from his father on the 7th, he notes the welcome intelligence that his father heard her is crossed out mother sing, a thing she has not done for a number of years. Without context, this entry is cryptic. Welcome intelligence for Charles Edward might suggest his mother was suffering some chronic malady and her spirits picked up, evidenced by her singing. Her condition might have been improving. To understand Charles Edward's daily personal interactions, it's helpful to list those immediately around him. We know he's staying in the house of his uncle and aunt, William Dickinson, M.D. and Evelina Crane Dickinson. Only one of the couple's 3 children survives, Lily, though an Evelina like her mother too, and she is 6. A young Charlie Hand is mentioned as often at the Dickinsons and in the company of Lily. He is 2 years old. Young Charlie Hand brings up the Crane household. Charlie and his parents, Nathan and Almira, are from Georgia and visiting the Cranes for several weeks. Crane, often mentioned in the diary, is brother to Aunt Evelina and Almira Hand. Crane is a St. Louis produce and provisions merchant, Francis W. Crane Company, 23, to whom Charles Edward is sent to buy hams and such. Francis and Sarah and Staples Crane have one grown son, Lara Crane, who now lives just outside St. Louis, and he's named after his grandfather, who was an alderman and councilman in Boston. Thus, for a few early weeks of 1868, 3 children of the Boston politician Lara Crane, 1784 to 1858 Francis W. Evelina and Almira were simultaneously in St. as noted in the diary. The visit of the Hands ended on February 20th when they left for home in Dahlonega, Georgia. Although the Dickinson residence is also the address for Uncle William's office, which Charles Edward confirms in the diary, the office probably had a separate entrance, for no mention is made of patients coming and going from the office. Also in the household, and common in those days, was hired help. Charles Edward refers to Hannah, our hired girl, and also mentions Lizzie and Annie. The latter two are probably German immigrants, for they compliment Charles Edward on his German. His entry for January 13th notes, "They say I pronounce very plain, so I will learn very soon." Besides his father and Uncle William, the other chief figure from the diary entries is the Reverend of his church, Dr.
Truman Marcellus Post.
It's hard to overestimate the importance of religion in Charles Edward's life. When Puritan Nathaniel Dickinson came to the colonies in 1636, religion was an essential, at least outwardly, for how Charles Edward's ancestors conducted themselves. Religion gave their lives context. The stipulation was that it was always Protestant. The Puritans became Congregationalists, as was Dr. Post's church, and possibly Presbyterian. The religious legacy of Charles Edward was strengthened by his grandfather, Reverend Pliny Dickinson, a Congregationalist minister in Walpole, New Hampshire, whose mentor was Reverend Joseph Lathrop of Springfield, Massachusetts, and for whom he named one of his sons. Moreover, Charles Edward's father, George Lyman, ran Dickinson's Temperance Hotel in Dubuque, 34, from 1849 to 1859. In the mid-1800s, conspicuously proclaiming the evils of alcohol resonated with the religious tenor of the times. Truman Marcellus Post, D.D., was a formidable religious leader in St. historically. He is identified with the anti-slavery stance he eloquently espoused as a Christian. He grew up in Vermont and went to Middlebury College. He first made his way west in stages, to Illinois, then Missouri. He taught history at Illinois College, a position he'd continue at Washington University in St. Louis, 43. The January 10th entry summarizes meeting with Dr. The Reverend recommends Charles Edward publicly affirm his faith in Christ and become a confirmed member of the church. Post advised me to make a public confession of Christ at the Young People's Prayer meeting on Monday, January 13th, and join the church next communion, January 19th. But Charles Edward procrastinates. He notes on January 24th, 2 weeks later, he had a conversation with Uncle William on the subject of religion and obtained some good advice. I'm sure Charles Edward took his uncle's words sincerely, and any hesitation about becoming a church member had more to do with his age, 17. He might have had an incomplete understanding of what was required of a church member. 3 weeks later, though, Charles Edward joins the church, and so does his friend Henry Ely Mack. Possibly the obligations of being a Christian started to make sense, and probably peer validation of doing so with a friend helped. But this is getting ahead in the diary. Returning to the first half of January, the reader is struck by Charles Edward's keen awareness of weather. Unlike modern times, he couldn't shield himself in a car once he left the house. He didn't ride a horse, and tended to avoid streetcars because, as he'd later note, January 18th, he wanted to save the 10 cents in streetcar fare. He was practicing economy. Charles Edward walked everywhere, observing weather directly. His clothes got wet if he was caught in a downpour. He saw how weather affected Mississippi River traffic. Winters, the river filled with dangerous blocks of ice. Many commercial ships tied up for the season. Repeatedly, Charles Edward will give specific temperature readings. On the 9th, he writes the temperature was 13°C above zero. But the pretty cold weather he notes on the 10th of 30 above zero was nothing compared to Iowa. On the 14th, he notes the temperature in Dubuque, at home, D, was 6 below zero. Presumably he read a newspaper report for Dubuque weather the day before. Always, weather was what Charles Edward faced when he left the house to attend school. To walk, by himself or with friends, or to run errands. His errands for uncle and aunt were, no doubt, part of the work for room and board. Among such errands in the first half of January were the following. On the 4th, he went to Mr. Crane's store for a ham, a walk of 11 blocks, and then to another store for a half-dozen quail. Later that day, he went to the Mercantile Library, a private subscription library which was a mere block from home, at the corner of Locust Street and 5th, to renew a book for Uncle William. On the 8th, he went to a carpenter's shop for a basket of shavings, an essential for starting wood fires at home. On the 10th, he went out to get a tick of shucks. This is what people had on their beds before mattresses. Briefly, beds in the 1800s were usually a wood frame with a web of ropes stretched between the rails. On these ropes was laid a canvas bag, the tick, filled with husks shucked from ears of corn, the shucks, the stuffed bag cushioned lying on the ropes. Corn shucks were cheap and an available stuffing at the time. A more desirable stuffing was used for the feather bed, feathers or goose down, that made a top insulating bed covering. We don't know who got the new tick of shucks, but it was someone in the Dickinson household. On the 11th, he took a letter to Mr. Crane's for Mrs. Hand, meaning he took the letter to Mr. Crane's store nearby, where the latter worked, and not to his home. Crane lived on Dayton and Glasgow, some 32 blocks distant, or about 2 miles away. The letter's origin is unknown, but this errand supports the idea Mrs. Hand, Aunt Evelina's sister Almira, and her husband Nathan were staying at the Cranes. On the 13th, Charles Edward returned to the carpenter for more fire starter shavings. He also picked up bottle blacking for Uncle William, doubtless for shoes. On the 14th, though not an errand, he shoveled snow. More payment for his room and board. In sum, the diary entries for the first 15 days of 1868 show complexity in Charles Edward's life. He interacts with several relatives. His uncle and aunt, who've given him room and board, but not without expectation of recompense. His 6-year-old cousin, Lily, and her young cousin Charlie Hand, but not Charles Edwards. When he has free time, he'll take them out for walks. Beyond relatives, There's the constellation of teachers, fellow students, and friends, of which a number attend the First Congregationalist Church, which at 10th and Locust is an easy walk of 4 blocks from home. And then there is the important figure of Dr. Post, who has significant influence on him, judging from how often he appears in the diary. Chapter 3 Chapter 3 Thursday, January 16, 1868. St. Louis arose at 4:03. My fire kept all night. A school as usual. Received a letter from Grandmother Smith today with very much good advice. Have concluded to drop Latin next term and take up mathematics altogether. Weather very pleasant. Mrs. Nellie were here this afternoon. I went after a basket of shavings. I bought me a bottle of mucilage for my own use. Friday 17 St. Louis arose at 5:15. A school as usual. Lessons all went off very good. It snowed a little last evening, but all disappeared before noon. Uncle Aunt gave a supper to some of the inmates of the St. Louis Institution for the Education of the Blind. Had a very pleasant time indeed. One of the blindest said she could see, and she got up and of course raised a laugh from the others who could hear her. I saw one of them home, and she remarked that it was an awkward extra. Saturday 18 St. Louis arose at 5:45. After breakfast I prepared to make some soap, an old trade of mine. Went to Mr. Crane's store for grease, to Meyer Brothers for potash. Got through with that and went out to Mr. Crane's house for some mackerel. Had a pleasant chat and then came home tired by my walk, as I walked both ways. About 54 or 55 blocks, to save 10 CTS, as I am practicing economy now. It was dark when I got home. Sunday, January 19, 1868, St. Louis arose at 5:30. Attended SS, and our class had the pleasure of being called upon to repeat a poem on a scriptural subject. Our teacher, Colonel Flint, to deliver an address. This afternoon went walking with Joss. While out it commenced to snow. It only lasted a few minutes, then rained. When I got home I was slightly reprimanded by Uncle, but more so by Aunt. I must say that I have not been away from the house a Sunday afternoon, but when I got back I was sure to get a scolding. Lathrop in time for prayer meeting. 7 o'clock, Monday 20 St. Louis arose at 5:30. A school as usual. Appointed teacher in spelling by Mr. Stone for 1 week. I teach Samuel Kopp. Taffel lead the singing this morning. He is our German teacher. Went to a charity concert this evening. It was splendid, especially the Orpheus Club and the piece entitled, Rocked in the Cradle of the Deep. It snowed again today, and when I came home I raised my muscle to the task of shoveling snow. Tuesday 21 St. Louis arose at 5. At school Mr. Taffel again lead the singing. Lessons all went off well. I have expelled my scholar and taken up Chaz. It has been very pleasant. Just snow enough on the ground to let a sleigh slide. Not many of them out. Ice has been floating down the river in large quantities for a week. Weather colder towards night. Wednesday, January 22, 1868, St. Louis arose at 5:45. A school as usual. Wrecked a letter from G. Co. at Thomas City, Iowa. Mailed one to Grandmother Smith and another to Father. It was pleasant till about 3 o'clock, when it commenced to rain just enough to make it disagreeable. Toward evening it grew cold, froze. Thursday 23 St. Louis arose at 5:30. Very slushy, but skating on some parts of the sidewalk. A school as usual. Missed 2 words in spelling. Stone advised me to study philosophy next term. I went to a soiree, through the kindness of Miss Plimpton, and heard some fine vocal instrumental music, especially the latter by a couple of young boys, one of which played a selection from Lucretia Borgia. The church had a sociable this evening at Mr. Holmes', but I was engaged. Weather colder. Wrecked a letter from Thomas City, Iowa. Friday 24 St. Louis arose at 5:45. A school as usual. Had another examination and passed without missing any. Making 840 words we have been examined for this term. Weather pretty comfortable. A little ice on the pavements, which the boys improve as there is not skating on the pond. Jackson made Foster believe that the sun sets in the east. I do not feel as well as usual. Had quite a long talk with Uncle William on the subject of religion and obtained some good advice. Saturday, January 25, 1868, St. Louis arose at 5. I have not felt well all day, consequently did not do much of anything this afternoon. I went down to Frenchtown to see an instrument which I found out was a new style of guitar. I inquired the price of a middling good one and lessons for 1/1/4. He said I could get through easy for 20.00. Breakage of strings book C. To be given 2 lessons a week. It has not been very cold. Sunday 26 St. Louis arose at 5:30. Attended SS and heard Dr. Post preach a sermon to young men, which he finished this evening. Concert for the first time since the school was organized. Verses of scripture with containing the word righteousness were recited. Brief speeches by Messrs. Kellogg, Flint, Post. Dr. Coonley was examined by the Church Committee for Entra NCE to the Church as a member and accepted. Will become a member next T Communion. The 2nd of February 1868. Monday 27 St. Louis arose at 5. All school as usual. Did not or will not recite any more spelling this time as I passed a satisfactory examination. I wrecked my writing desk today and am very much pleased with it. I went down to the AE company and brought it home on my shoulder. There were charges on it amounting to 1.98, but through the kindness it was checked off. Weather pretty cold. Attended prayer meeting or went to church, but prayer meeting was postponed. Tuesday, January 28, 1868, St. Louis arose at 5:30. A school as usual. Wrecked a letter from home. Pretty cold all day. Examinations commence tomorrow in the university. Jackson is giving a good long review in Latin. Nothing of vital importance today. Wednesday 29 St. Louis arose at 5:30. A school as usual. Recited our last lesson in physical geography. In going to school I froze my left ear. The weather was 2 degrees below zero. Wrecked a letter from Bro. River closed tonight. Went to prayer meeting and heard Dr. Post read his report for the past year. They elected Mr. Coonley as deacon, it being an adjourned meeting more than anything else. Had quite a chat with young Mr. He is a fine young man. Thursday 30 St. Louis arose at 6 o'clock. Had examinations in Latin Phys. Geography. Spelling. Passed in all. Answered a letter of Bro. Wills received yesterday. Weather very pleasant, looks like rain. Bought me 2 books of Philosophy Felter's Arithmetic for 1.60 second-handed. Also a pair of kid dress gloves for 2.50. Friday, January 31st, 1868 St. Louis arose at 5:30. A school as usual. Last day of the first term. Had an examination in German in which Professor Taffel said I did very well. Weather pretty cool. Attended the preparatory lecture before communion. Delivered by Doctor. It was good, particularly the point we should help one another and not come to church and show an outward feeling of piety while all within is corrupt. Mrs. Harris and 2 more. Mac Dickinson were voted acceptable and will be entered Sunday, February 2nd. Chapter 4 Chapter 4 The diary entries for the second half of January have a few important details. On January 16th, Charles Edward notes he received a letter from Grandmother Smith with very much good advice. Smith is such a common last name, one might assume this is not his paternal grandmother. But Grandmother Smith was married to the Reverend Pliny Dickinson, Charles Edward's grandfather. Grandmother Smith was born Mary Bellows, the daughter of Colonel Caleb and Mary Bellows of Walpole, New Hampshire. Mary and Reverend Pliny were married in October of 1819. She was 19, he was 42. Not only was there a large age difference between the two, 23 years, but Reverend Pliny came to know Mary when he took a room in Colonel Caleb's household after assuming the pastorate of Walpole's Town Church, Congregational, in 1805. Mary Bellows was then 5 years old. 14 years later, the colonel was upset when wedding banns, marriage plans, were announced in church. Her father rising in church and exclaiming, "I forbid the banns." 29. Nonetheless, the two married and had 10 children before Reverend Pliny, while visiting in Amherst, Massachusetts, suffered a stroke and died on August 27, 1834, 3 days shy of his 57th birthday. 11. The day of Reverend Pliny's death was a Wednesday, so it's unlikely the occasion for his visit was for church or college. More likely he was visiting relatives or friends. Many Dickinsons live in the Amherst area. The patriarch of Pliny's Dickinson lineage was, as mentioned before, Nathaniel Dickinson, who co-founded Hadley, Massachusetts. He had 13 children, many continuing to live in Hadley, Amherst, 6 miles east, or Granby, where Pliny was born, 10 miles southeast. Thus, the visit 51 miles downriver, as the crow flies, from Walpole was doubtless among long acquaintances. A connection to Amherst College would have been that Pliny was a fourth cousin of William Fowler Dickinson, a founder of the college and also known as the grandfather in 1834 of 4-year-old Emily, who would give Amherst, Massachusetts, lasting distinction. And for the record, Emily and Charles Edward, of the same generation, were sixth cousins. Reverend Pliny's sudden death left Mary Bellows Dickinson a widow at the age of 34. Her comparative youth must have made for what were considered at the time excellent remarriage prospects. She would remarry twice. She married James Crawford in 1838, and they moved to Dubuque, Iowa, and he would die in 1846. In 1861, Mary married George Smith, originally born in Walpole, but living in Dubuque, and Mary once again became a widow with his death in March 1868. That event was not noted, however, in Charles Edward's diary. A diary entry for January 18th has a detail that clarifies Charles Edward's relationship to Mr. Crane, who's often mentioned. The latter is Aunt Evelina's brother, Francis Watson. So though Charles Edward is not a blood relative, he has a special relationship with the Cranes. The important detail is that Charles Edward goes to Mr. Crane's store, which confirms Mr. Crane sells food. The next sentence, however, in which Charles Edward goes to Mr. Crane's house for some mackerel, tends to confuse the entries that follow where he mentions going to Mr. Crane to buy what's usually meats. Evidently, Mr. Crane would sell out of home storage, doubtless on account for his in-laws. The entry for the following day, Sunday, January 19th, makes it clear the relationship between adults and young adults had an edge that might not be understood today. Until someone was independent of their parents, or in Charles Edward's situation, his uncle and aunt, standing in for parents. The young adult might be treated like a minor not mature enough to know how to act independently. Charles Edward writes he took the hours after church and Sunday school to go walking with his friend Joseph Lathrop, which seems reasonable, for the two young men enjoyed walking outdoors and talking. He relates how it began to snow, then a few minutes later it rained. When he got home that afternoon, he must have been wet. He then mentions he was slightly reprimanded by uncle, but more so by Aunt Evelina. These cross words weren't just for getting wet. No, he immediately adds, every Sunday afternoon when he is away from the house and comes back, he is sure to get a scolding. Charles Edward is saying he is not getting the respect a young man of 17 deserves. He is living away from home, presumably as he did the year before at Grinnell, and though not independent, he deserves some autonomy and need not have a scolding, as if a misbehaving child, for spending time with a friend his own age. He gives this scolding special attention. As is evident from reading the diary entries, Charles Edward is usually an even-tempered fellow. His outlook on life has an amused detachment as he stoically goes about his business, not complaining about the weather or the chores he has to do. So mention of the scolding as part of a pattern for his Sunday afternoon outings marks an emotional rift developing between nephew and uncle and aunt. In the 5th month of his academy school year, his stay has taken on inhospitable overtones. A few days later, on the 22nd, he receives a letter from G. Coe, his Grinnell roommate from the preceding school year. He'd written Coe on the 4th. Evidently, like Charles Edward, G. Coe has left Grinnell, for he writes from Tama City, now Tama, Iowa. If Charles Edward has reason to resent his uncle and aunt's slights, he also appreciates the relationship is complex and dependent. He must strive for accommodation to avoid open bickering. Thus, he notes on the 24th a long conversation he has with Uncle William on the subject of religion. The topic had come up when he met with Dr. Post about becoming a member of the First Congregational Church. It's not a choice Charles Edward makes immediately, and whether Uncle William's advice was asked for or unsolicited, we do not know. What is clear in this instance is Charles Edward shows respect for an adult's understanding of religion and accepts, apparently, what his uncle says at face value. And because he does join the church in February at the same time as his friend Henry Mack, he probably went to his peer to talk it over, and they must have agreed to do so together. One topic that invariably comes up in the diary for Mondays through Fridays is an accounting for his schooling. Often he makes a cursory remark like, "At school as usual," but he'll also go on to say how he did. He tells how many words he missed in spelling, January 23rd and 24th entries. That he was an accomplished speller is suggested by the entry for January 20th. Stone, principal of the academy and professor of rhetoric, appoints him to be a teacher in spelling for a week. He is to teach a younger student, Samuel Copp. Later, in a novel phrasing with a pun, he says he has expelled his scholar, meaning Mr. Copp, and will now take up teaching another student, Charles Lamoureux. Charles Edward was 1 year older than both Copp and Lamoureux. Evidently, Mr. Stone recognized Charles Edward's facility with spelling and his ability to communicate and teach. Later in the diary, we see more evidence of this talent when he teaches Sunday school class to girls at the Biddle Street Mission in the afternoon, once he's done with his morning church activities. The classes Charles Edward will take in the second semester, once he finishes the examination period in late January, are as follows. Philosophy, which he was advised to take by Mr. Stone. See January 23rd entry. Philosophy means natural philosophy, which is the older term for what we now call science, the latter term gaining currency in the late 1800s. Felter's arithmetic. This was a popular series of textbooks that went well beyond basic arithmetic. An emphasis was placed on using arithmetic with everyday examples, with problems in surveying, liquid and dry measure, compound numbers, and money, especially loan and interest payments. German. Charles Edward continues his study of German from the first semester and drops Latin. He must have thought German had more future value for him than the dead language Latin. Certainly, there were many German immigrants in St. Louis at the time. Speaking German might be put to practical use right away. As Charles Edward notes, the hired help in the Dickinson household, Annie and Hannah, were fluent in German. Charles Edward, for years later, would go on to marry a woman who was born in Germany. Writing and spelling, composition and declamation. To recap, Charles Edward continues German and writing and spelling from the first term. He finishes physical geography and drops Latin of the first term. In the second term, he adds philosophy or science and Felter's arithmetic. He takes 4 classes each term. As noted earlier in a January entry, Charles Edward inquired about the cost to have a writing desk built. He'd like it to have the same dimensions of the one he left at home, one he used the year before at Grinnell. Lara Crane, Mr. Crane's son, works as a messenger and suggests on January 5th he write home and have the writing desk sent in his, Lara's, name. Why have a new one built? To his delight, he receives his old writing desk on the 27th. The charges amount to $1.98. After a walk of 4 blocks to North 3rd, he picks it up at the A.E. Company, most likely the St. Louis office of American Merchants Union Express Company, or which on February 6th he will refer to as MUX Co's. He acknowledges mercy for, through the kindness it was checked off. He didn't have to pay the charges. Having it sent in Lara's name, and Lara probably a messenger for that company, must have made the shipping from Dubuque an employee benefit. Charles Edward's reunion with his writing desk was that much more of a joy. One of the striking features of the diary entries, illustrated in the second half of January, is how Charles Edward participated in a fairly busy social life. On the 17th, he notes the night before his uncle and aunt gave a supper for some of the inmates of the St. Louis Institution for Education of the Blind. A fitting gesture by Dr. Dickinson, whose specialty was helping persons with vision problems. After dinner, Charles Edward walks one of the blind women home. She remarks, touchingly, that it was an awkward extra. Another evening social event is 3 days later, when on the 20th he goes to a charity concert put on by the Orpheus Club. It features a spiritual performance, Rocked in the Cradle of the Deep. Charles Edward must have enjoyed different music, for 3 days later, he goes to a soiree in which vocal and instrumental music is performed, especially the latter by a couple of young boys, one of which played a selection by Lucretia Borgia. He notes because he was at the soirée, he was not able to attend a sociable, what we now call a social, at his church that same evening. He was engaged, for live music had its own draw. Besides the concerts, there were regular church prayer meetings weekly, and for young men in particular, all of which occur often enough. He occasionally remarks he had to study instead, or the weather was too cold. It's essential to appreciate in 1868, people didn't have the choice of spending evenings watching television, streaming video, and other mass entertainment. And, perhaps, they spent more free time as a community, making those social interactions that gave them a better sense of how they depended on each other. 2 days after Charles Edward enjoys the instrumental musical selection of Lucretia Borgia, he explores the idea he might make music himself. Whether this was a spur-of-the-moment impulse or not, we don't know. He goes to a store in Frenchtown. St. Louis had a well-developed French cultural heritage, to see an instrument which I found out is a new style of guitar. We don't know what the guitar variant was called, but Charles Edward's curiosity was probably sparked by seeing one like it 2 nights before when the couple of young boys played the Borgia selection. What is interesting about this entry, other than naming a desire to learn an instrument, a desire he did not follow up on, was the specifics about how he'd take up the guitar. He wants to know the price of a middling good one, not the best or the cheapest. He wants to take lessons twice a week for 1/4, 3 months. And the answer is that he could get by for 20.00. Reading his cash account records that month, it was probably a financially embarrassed reach too far. He had to mull it over. That Charles Edward didn't follow up on learning the guitar is not the main point. What is notable is that as a young man, he greatly enjoys the pleasure of hearing live music, which was all that was available before recorded music. That he would investigate creating his own music testifies to his enjoyment of evening concerts. The entry for Tuesday, January 28th, ends with the sentence, "Nothing of vital importance today." This is a stock phrase he will use later in the diary. Other stock phrases include, "at school as usual," and "lessons all went off well." The use of these stock phrases shows his interest in a complete accounting of the day for his own satisfaction, even if the day was routine. And "lessons all went off well," as a stock phrase suggests self-acceptance of how as a student he's usually performing up to the mark. The entry for Monday, January 20th, ends with the phrase, "when I raised my muscle up to the task of shoveling snow." This is a good example of the humor often inserted into daily accounts. The tone, gently ironic, can take on an almost detached amusement at what he observes or does, especially here. It's a chore assigned by Uncle William. In contrast to his uncle, the truly positive figure in Charles Edward's life, across the diary pages, was Doctor. He meets with the pastor and before long will act on the latter suggestion to commit his life to Christ and join the congregation. His respect for Dr. Post shows forth in the entry of January 31st, a Friday in which he attends an evening lecture. He says of Dr. Post's words, "It was good, particularly the point we should help one another and not come to church and show an outward feeling of piety while all within is corrupt." Charles Edward must see Dr. Post as embodying this ideal and without hypocrisy. Originally from New England, Dr. Post strongly advocated abolishing slavery. His public voice was among those who kept Missouri in the Union during the war years. Thus, Charles Edward saw Dr. Post worthy of emulation for the ideals he espoused. A few days earlier, on the 29th, Charles Edward speaks with Dr. Post's son, also a student at the academy, but a year ahead. He remarks, "He is a fine young man." Obviously, Charles Edward sees in Martin Hayward Post a reflection of what he admires in Doctor at the end of January. Charles Edward has finished his first-term final examinations and passed them. He looks forward to the second term with 2 new subjects, philosophy and Felter's arithmetic. Therefore, he buys a copy of the philosophy book for 1.00 and a copy of Felter's arithmetic for 0.60. Both copies are second-handed. The expense entries dovetail with his cash account entries in the back of the diary. Here, as in other instances, he accounts for the money he receives and the money he spends. As for the German class, we might assume he continued with a textbook from the first term. By March, however, and this is looking ahead, he has made progress and enjoys his developing fluency. He writes in his cash account that he bought an English dictionary in German, and Englische Wörterbuch, for 1.75. Unfortunately for modern eyes, he doesn't write this purchase down in Roman script. Because of confidence in how he's making progress with the German language, he writes the entry in current schrift, a German handwriting script that will be abandoned in Germany by the 1930s. His learning current will play an important part in how we read a climactic scene late in the diary when Uncle William confronts his nephew. But that will have to wait several chapters. So as the second half of January draws to a close, Charles Edward is poised to become a member of his church congregation, whose pastor he greatly admires, and he's ready to start the second term of his school year at the academy. Chapter 5 Chapter 5 Saturday. February 1st, St. Louis arose at 5:30. Went to work after breakfast to clean up the cellar. Sawed split wood and I got through at 3 p.m. Took my boots to a German named Heider to have them half-sole charges 1.50. Uncle came up this evening and we had a very pleasant time. He giving advice preparing me for the communion tomorrow. Sunday 2 Saint arose at 5:30. Did not attend SS, but went to church and heard a good sermon. Text, speaking of wisdom. All her ways are righteousness and all her paths are peace. I attended communion and made a profession of religion. Henry Mack joining the church at the same time. Weather being fine for the time of year. Wrote a letter to H. Robbins at Grinnell, Iowa. Went this morning to Biddle St. between 10th 11th for boots charges. 1.50 reasonable. Monday, February 3rd, 1868, St. Louis arose at 5:30. A school as usual. Commencement of the second or summer term. I take philosophy, Felter's arithmetic, German spelling. Did not have any recitations as it took pretty near all day to arrange classes. Wrecked a bundle from Lara Crane at St. Charles, Missouri for the laundry. Wrecked a letter from father. Weather pleasant. Hannah, our hired girl, like to have burned her face badly at the furnace. When I came home, filled my water barrel. Tuesday 4 St. Louis arose at 5:15. At school lessons commenced in earnest. I recite 8 lessons before 1 after recess. Christian convention commenced today at Dr. Nelson's church on the corner of 14th Lucas Place. Picked over a bushel of cranberries this evening. Weather very pleasant. Wednesday 5 St. Louis arose at 5:30. A school as usual. Lessons went off very well. Answered a letter of father's. Was requested invited to attend a meeting at Dr. Nelson's church, but my lessons would not permit. Went after a basket of shavings to the carpenter shop next to the gymnasium on St. Weather very pleasant. Thursday, February 6th, 1868, St. Louis arose at 5:30. Arithmetic lessons not perfect. All other lessons were. Wrecked a letter from Lara Crane requesting his clothes at Mr. Crane's house. I went to the M. Exco's American Merchants Union Express Company office and Mr. Crane's office to see if any letters had come for him. Attended the last meeting of the Christian Association. It was interesting and 12 or 14 stood up to be prayed for. Weather pleasant. Friday 7 Saint did not get up till 6. A school as usual. Arithmetic not perfect. The class I was in spelling, last term was excused at noon and I with it as I had spelled 4 out of 5 Fridays with them. Went to Proctor Greenwood's for Codfish 24. Attended the weekly sociable held in the lecture room of the church. Quite a large gathering. Made some very pleasant acquaintances. Weather very pleasant. Saturday 8 Saint arose at 6. Did not have much to do. Sawed a little would see. Abbreviation for etc. The substitutes for Latin et and etc. Other things. Abbreviates as C. Common abbreviation for the period. Hannah was taken sick and went home. Went got a hoop for a washtub and put it on. This evening attended a private sociable given by Dr. Weslazini's. Taffel my German teacher was there and I had a very pleasant time. Weather pleasant till evening when it changed cold snowed. Sunday, February 9th, 1868, St. Louis arose at 6, made my fire, shoveled off the sidewalk before breakfast. Attended S. Church, heard a fine discourse. Post showing that each one of us had a mission to fulfill. Went to the Biddle St. Mission School and had the pleasure of teaching, for the first time, a fine class of girls. They recited 12 verses. Attended church and heard a minister from Memphis, Tennessee preach, "The time is short." Text. Weather cold. Today is Mother's birthday. 48 years old. Monday 10 Bro. George is 9 years old today. Louis arose at 6 o'clock. A school as usual. Lessons all went off well. Had quite a snowstorm last evening and this a.m. I had a nice little time shoveling it away and attended the young people's prayer meeting at our church and heard an instance in which the convention held here last week made a hopeful convert. Weather pretty cold. Tuesday 11 St. Louis arose at 6:15 and arrived downstairs to find my fire made and place cleaned up. Went to school as usual. Lessons well. Wrecked a letter from father with 2.00 enclosed. Work commenced on the bridge at Dubuque Avenue. Still crossing on the ice at this point. Wednesday, February 12, 1868, St. Louis arose at 6. Attended school but did not much in the way of study as I had the toothache very bad. Weather cold. Snow. Thursday 13 St. Louis arose at 5:15. Same had my tooth drawn by Uncle William. I never suffered so much pain in my life. Friday 14 arose at 5:30. Same sick all day. Saturday, February 15, 1868, arose at 5:30 with the jaw ache. Did not do much. Took a walk down to the river to see the ferry boats breaking the ice for a channel. Also went to Mr. Crane's for an order on Mr. Gallinen for a ham. Sick all day. Chapter 6 == Chapter 6 Charles Edward's diary entries for the first half of February start on a high note and end on a low note. On the 2nd of February, a Sunday, Charles Edward stands at communion in the First Congregational Church of St. Louis and makes his profession of faith as a Christian and becomes a church member. By his side, also making this solemn commitment to join the congregation, is his friend from school Henry Ely Mack. That Charles Edward felt he was ready for church membership is shown by his comment that he heard a good sermon by Dr. Post beforehand. He quotes Dr. Post, who spoke of wisdom, personified as a woman in customary Old Testament fashion. All her ways are righteousness and all her paths are peace. This discriminating enjoyment of a sermon is in keeping with a strong religious tradition in the Dickinson lineage. His grandfather was a congregational minister. His father ran a temperance hotel in Dubuque, when the temperance movement religiously argued alcohol defiled the human body, God's temple. Only 7 days after joining the church, Charles Edward has a new responsibility: teaching Sunday school to a class of girls at the Biddle Street Mission. A mission, in this context, is defined as a church that's not fully self-supporting, but reliant on a relationship with larger churches. Biddle Street Presbyterian Mission in St. Louis served its congregation from 1864 to 1880 and was at 15th and Biddle Avenue. Charles Edward had a walk of 14 blocks, or about a mile, from First Congregational at 10th and Locust to the mission. Charles Edward greatly enjoyed teaching this class, the size of which he will note on March 1st was 9 scholars present. Teaching shows an active, not passive, understanding of Scripture and Christian teachings as they apply in everyday life. Going from professing one's Christian belief to teaching others in Sunday school shows commitment to a way of life prevalent in both his family and the social class he represented. That it was less about saving his soul in the hereafter and more about conforming to and accepting social values goes without saying. Besides teaching a class at the mission, consider how much of Charles Edward's time is spent on church-related activity. On Sundays, he goes to Sunday school and a morning sermon before the class he teaches, and sometimes an evening sermon. For example, on February 9th, he attends church for an evening sermon by a minister visiting from Memphis. In the middle of the week, on school nights, he also has meetings at the church. As on Monday, February 10th, it's a young people's evening prayer meeting. That said, it's interesting he is invited to a meeting at Dr. Nelson's church, First Presbyterian Church of St. Louis, but declines as his studies would not permit. There is a limit to how much church activity he can squeeze in. If February had an upbeat beginning, it would turn much worse on Tuesday the 12th, when he writes he had a bad toothache. The next day, Uncle William pulls the tooth. It's unlikely Charles Edward had any anesthesia. When he says he never suffered so much pain in my life, that is not exaggeration. Dentists would start using local anesthesia like Novocaine 50 years later. Still, to go from toothache one day to tooth extraction the next shows Uncle William's supreme confidence in his medical experience and judgment. Keep in mind that Charles Edward's older brother William Pliny was a dentist, but hundreds of miles away. So Uncle William was unfazed about pulling a tooth in the family, even if he'd hear about it later if it didn't go well. The point is Uncle William was well qualified to do simple surgery like a tooth extraction. He might have taken steps to prevent infection, notwithstanding Joseph Lister's sterilization measures, derived from Louis Pasteur's theory of germs, were only recently practiced. Although a specialist in eye disorders, Uncle William had a medical degree from Harvard and served in the Civil War as a Union Brigade surgeon. I've read an account of his removing a bullet from a wounded soldier's skull under battle conditions, with the important footnote that the patient developed an infection, encephalitis. Uncle William was unaware then of the important contribution Lister would make to medicine only a few years later. So, yes, although Uncle William would not know what to do about a dental cavity, he was qualified to remove a tooth. The more pertinent question was whether he decided to extract too soon. This was before the days of X-rays, before it was possible to assess damage to the tooth below the gum. But it is true that if a tooth aches, removal of the tooth and associated nerves means the pain will cease. The follow-up recovery doesn't appear to have been drawn out. Charles Edward reports he was sick all day, the next 2 days, then doesn't mention any aftereffects in later entries. It's noteworthy that until February 13th, when the tooth is drawn, he has added St. Louis to the date heading for each entry. Sometimes he writes the letters with a bit of penciled embellishment, as if taking a few moments to linger with the place name. In each of these diary entries for 6 weeks, he is consciously noting where he is geographically. It's as if he wants to remind himself that he's away from home. The next day, February 14th, he omits the penciled place notation, and for the rest of his diary pages, with only an exception or two, he does not write St. Louis again, while leaving out St. Louis atop his daily entries might suggest he wished to be elsewhere. That's speculative. What's probable is the tooth extraction by Uncle William, how it was done and the pain, broke down some of Charles Edward's disciplined approach to his diary, and was another possible sign of a simmering uncle-nephew conflict. One reminder of how people lived in the St. Louis of 1868 is the Monday, February 3rd comment that he came home and filled my water barrel. This tells us indoor plumbing, that is, tap water, was uncommon in 1868 anywhere in America. The Dickinson household most likely had a water pump beside the kitchen sink, the handle of which was pulled and pushed to bring up well water. For Charles Edward, his personal water barrel was possibly to fill a basin for washing up, which might not have had a drain for wastewater. Or the water barrel might have had a ladle to drink water or boil it in a kettle. But nothing in the diary explains how he used his personal water barrel. Probably it was for personal hygiene. The entry for February 3rd also marks the start of the second term at the academy. As he notes, that first day little classwork took place, teachers and students spending most of the time arranging classes. He has 4 classes. I take philosophy, natural philosophy, or what we now call science, Felter's arithmetic, German spelling. The class spelling is not just about learning to spell correctly. The full university catalog title for the class is Writing and Spelling, Composition and Declamation. We commonly refer to such a class as English, with an emphasis on composition. Continuing a theme from January, Charles Edward is exceedingly observant about weather. As mentioned before, whenever he leaves the house, he is in the weather. He walks unshielded by any modern automobile. It is winter and freezing. Stormy weather is expected. The reader senses gratitude on February 8th that he's left the house and dodged what Mother Nature might throw at him, having weather pleasant until evening when it changed cold snowed. For the next week of entries, Charles Edward adds to weather cold or weather pretty cold some specifics. On the 11th, he observes that work has begun on a bridge across the Mississippi River at Dubuque Avenue, but apparently people are still crossing on the ice at that point. And on the 15th, He walks down to the river to see ferry boats breaking the ice for a channel. We get the picture of river traffic temporarily halted with the onslaught of icy winter storms. As the diary unfolds, Charles Edward will also point out how traffic on the river picks up after the winter season ends. A common topic of Charles Edward's diary entries is his chores. Some are straightforward, others a puzzle. When he says he picked over a bushel of cranberries, we know he's sorted out the bad ones. But when he says he wrecked a bundle from Lara Crane, Mr. Crane's son, at St. Charles, now part of suburban St. Louis, for the laundry, we have a puzzle on our hands. Was Lara sending his clothes home to be washed? That seems an obvious interpretation. If so, was it economical to mail a bundle of clothes rather than having them washed locally? For if, as suggested in the preceding chapter, Lara was a messenger for the American Merchants Union Express Company, he apparently could have packages sent gratis as an employee. The entry is dated February 3rd. What confuses is that 3 days later, on the 6th, Lara Crane sends Charles Edward a letter requesting his clothes at Mr. Crane's house. Does this mean Lara left some clothes at his parents' house before leaving for St., or does it mean he wants his clothes sent on February 3rd, if washed, returned? Moreover, why is Charles Edward the go-between in this intrafamily transaction? This instance points up why deriving meaning from a diary can be a problem. No one is around to speak to the ambiguity or give context to what was written. One other revealing, not puzzling, comment, again from the 3rd, Charles Edward mentions Hannah and in parentheses adds, "our hired girl." It was common in the 1860s to employ hired help. Housekeeping was laborious. Modern labor-saving washing machines, vacuum cleaners, and the like did not exist. Keeping a middle to upper-middle-class household took hours of work. In the Dickinson household, we have mentions of Hannah and Annie in the diary. As a side note, 8 years earlier, the 1860 U.S. Census recorded 2 servantesses in the William Dickinson household, Catherine, age 20, and Mary, age 19. Both were immigrants from England. Having domestic help didn't mean others in the family merely supervised. Far from it, Charles Edward did many chores. When there's an overnight snowstorm on the 10th, he humorously comments, "I had a nice little time shoveling it away." On Saturday, February 1st, Charles Edward went to a bootmaker named Hyder to ask about having his boots half-soled. The charge would be $1.50, and he left the boots for repair. He came back the next day, a Sunday, after church and paid for the repair. He notes, boot charges, $1.50 reasonable. It's interesting he paid for this out of his own money. At the beginning of February, his cash on hand, according to his monthly cash accounts, to be discussed later, amounted to only $1.40. So before he picked up his boots, he borrowed 10 cents from Uncle William. That's noted in the cash accounts, as well as his repayment to Uncle William of the 10 cents on February 14th, after receiving $2.00 cash in a letter from his father. This brings up the question, what money did Charles Edward have? In brief, little. He had no income-producing job. He was a student. Presumably, his father took care of the tuition fees for the academy by correspondence with the university. The only discernible source of money for Charles Edward was dollar bills from home, usually a $2.00 bill. In March, we'll see an exception. He'll get a draft for $25.00 and a $2.00 bill. The total of $27.00 is sent with the understanding it's for a suit of clothes. He'll later spend $21.00 on April 25th for the suit. Although Charles Edward had little more than pocket money, he accounted for every cent in his cash accounts. This is more evidence of his facility and accuracy with numbers. While having little for discretionary spending, as for that new style guitar in the Frenchtown shop, Charles Edward dutifully did a substantial amount of unpaid work. Some chores Charles Edward had to do were just part of being in a household. In the first half of February, he picks over cranberries, February 4th, and gets a basket of wood shavings at the carpenter, February 5th. But other errands, like going to Mr. Crane's store on February 14th for a ham on order for Mr. Gallinan, seemed like an unpaid favor he was expected to do for someone outside the household, someone not a relative. Gallinan was probably a neighbor unable to get out and buy food. Charles Edward got the assignment and does so out of duty, for he also notes he was sick all day. Similarly, on February 7th he goes to Procter, Greenwood Company to pick up 24 pounds of codfish, a walk of 5 blocks each way for him. This was not likely for home consumption, and probably intended for an outside event, as one at his church. One such event where many would be fed was a Christian convention that began February 4th at Dr. Nelson's First Presbyterian Church and lasted 3 days. Nelson's church at 14th and Lucas Place was a walk of 8 blocks from home for Charles Edward. The attendees presumably were from different Protestant denominations. Charles Edward attends the last meeting of the Christian Association and notes, 12 or 14 stood up to be prayed for. Doubtless attending the convention was a minister from Memphis who preached at Dr. Post's church on the following Sunday, February 9th. Once again, Charles Edward's comments about the Christian convention and his participation evidence how religious observance and church activities were needed in his social world. It is as if he regards the church with its services, meetings, and sociables as the glue that holds his world, beyond school, together. He does, however, make a distinction for social activity not at church. On Saturday, February 9th, he attends a private sociable given by Dr. Wislizinus, father of his friend Fred Wislizinus. Away from the academy, the two go for walks. That he distinguishes a private sociable from a church one must mean the former invitation. Only gatherings weren't as common as those at the church that filled out his weeks. As mentioned before, Charles Edward would write in his diary the birthdays of family members both in advance and above his diary entries for the day. A surprising exception to this concerns the entry for February 9th. At the end of the entry describing the day's events, he writes, "Today is Mother's birthday, 48 years old. Why did he not fill out a birthday reminder for her in advance as he did for the rest of his family? Why did he note her birthday after his account for the day? Charles Edward might know something about his mother's health he won't share with himself on the written page, as if he is repressing a fear for her tenuous hold on life. The only earlier entry he makes about his mother is a comment his father makes in a letter. His mother had been singing, something she hadn't done in years. It's an odd remark, and suggests his mother's mental state was filled with a longing for the past. Her condition is a mystery, and nothing in the diary suggests Charles Edward corresponded with his mother during 1868. His family letters go to others: his father, brother William Pliny, and grandmother Smith. Chapter 7 Chapter 7 Sunday 16, arose at 6. Went to Sunday school church. Post on text. What should it profit a man if he gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Attended the Biddle St. Mission SS in which I have a class. Weather very pleasant. Monday 17 arose at 6 o'clock. A school as usual. When I came home I had a long talk with Uncle William in regard to my duties being performed with greater alacrity. Wrecked a letter from home, a valentine from Fred. Weather pleasant. Tuesday, February 18th, 1868 arose at 5:30. At school I attended the weekly sociable held at our church and gained a severe headache. I went to bed in a hurry. Weather pleasant and the river has broken up and is open to Alton. Wednesday 19 arose at 5 o'clock. At school with a sick head. Lessons not exceedingly brilliant. Weather very pleasant indeed. Boats arriving daily from below. Hand start for Dahlonega, Georgia tomorrow afternoon. Thursday 20 arose at 6 feeling very bad but did my work, attended school. Was excused after my German. Mr. Mrs. plus Charlie. Left this afternoon at 2 o'clock for Georgia. Weather very pleasant and has been for several days. Took a short walk. Friday, February 21st, 1868 arose at 6 o'clock. About the same as yesterday if not worse. Did not light the fire as it is very pleasant. Took a walk this morning but this afternoon I laid abed. Today, is the anniversary of our institution and there will be orations, declamations, music extemporis. Saturday 22 arose at 6 feeling pretty well. Split kindling, did other minor jobs. I commenced to feel unwell and stopped operations for the day. It is very pleasant. The sun shining brightly. River open and hardly any ice floating. Went walking on the levee, counted from 20 to 30 steamers just come out of winter quarters. Some loading for the Missouri, some for New Orleans. Sunday 23 arose at 5:30, not feeling very well. Did not attend SS. Went to church, heard a good sermon by Dr. Attended the mission SS and took my little class. Morrison gave to all of the school a little book, to a few others for attendance, learning the entire lesson every Sunday, a Bible or some suitable present. Monday, February 24, 1868 arose at 6. At school, philosophy did not go off as well as usual, so I stayed and accepted alternative spelling for the past tense of stay, 63, in to understand the rule about finding the specific gravity of a body that will not sink in water. Weather very pleasant. Got the barrel that was in the cellar emptied, fixed in the yard, filled. Tuesday 25 arose at 6:15. Lessons all went off well. I had to make my fire up as it was out. Went after shavings, split kindlings. Weather very pleasant. Wrecked in a letter from Father 2.00. Wednesday 26 arose at 6. A school as usual. Weather very pleasant. Expected the Chancellor would announce a holiday tomorrow, but he did not. Lessons all went of F well as usual. Thursday, February 27, 1868 arose at 5:30. Weather colder than yesterday. Today is the day of prayer for all colleges, held by all churches. Services at Dr. Post's at 10:30 a.m. Attended the prayer meeting in the evening. Friday 28 arose at 5:45. A school as usual. Lessons all went off well. Weather somewhat cool, just to counterbalance the good weather somewhat we have been having. Went to Mr. Crane's for an order on Ed. Gallahan sick for 4 hams. 2 canvas, 2 knot. Bulk weight 54. Pretty heavy load for a small boy. Saturday 29 arose at 5:30. Did not have much to do, so spent most of the day in walking. Saw a great many steamers placarded for the different rivers, Ills, Ohio, Mo, New Orleans. Business seems to be brisk on the levee. Wind blew pretty cold while on the levee, clouds of dust, actual dust. Arose thick enough to choke a person, but I survived them, arrived home none the worse for wear. Chapter 8 Chapter 8, the second half of February, begins with Sunday activities that are routine for Charles Edward. He goes to Sunday school, and that is followed by a sermon from Dr. Post, the theme being, what should it profit a man if he gain the world and loses his soul? Again, a sermon impresses Charles Edward enough for him to mention it in the diary. After the sermon, he goes to the Biddle Street Mission and teaches a Sunday school class to his young girl scholars. Bible verse recitation being a highlight. The Monday entry which follows his Sunday recap has a telling sentence. After he came home from school, I had a long talk with Uncle William in regard to my duties being performed with greater alacrity. This is more evidence of a strain in the relationship between Charles Edward and his uncle. Nothing up to the February 17th entry suggests he's done anything to make himself unwelcome in the household. In fact, he appears to want to see his uncle in a positive, supportive light, what he would like from an older male relative. Namely, just before joining the church on February 2nd, he had a talk with Uncle William the evening before and writes, "We had a very pleasant time. He giving me advice and preparing me for the communion tomorrow." Obviously, Charles Edward harbors no ill will or prejudice toward his uncle. But Uncle William appears to have animosity toward his nephew. The greater alacrity admonishment strikes to the core of Uncle William's growing emotional rift with his nephew. He mentions duties. Duties are, in Uncle's mind, Charles Edward's obligation for getting room and board while attending school away from home. In 1868, no student at Washington University in St. Louis, whether the preparatory schools, the academy, or the Mary Institute, or the collegiate departments, lived on campus. The university had no dormitories, so Charles Edward essentially had no choice other than to live with his uncle and aunt. Uncle William was educated, and if he used the word alacrity, he knew it meant cheerful readiness, willingness, as defined by Webster's Unabridged Dictionary 1900, comprising the issues of 1864, 1879, and 1884. Clearly, Uncle William was not suggesting a shortfall in performing duties. Instead, he was saying he didn't like the attitude of Charles Edward. Perception of attitude can be wholly subjective. Moreover, it's unlikely Charles Edward had any say in his living arrangements while attending the academy. That arrangement undoubtedly was made between his father, George Lyman, and Uncle William. It was an agreement by brothers. Thus, in more ways than one, Charles Edward is engaged in a contest he can't win. It might seem rash to describe a relationship as troubled because of a few words, alacrity and duties. But as we take up later developments in the diary, this characterization of the uncle-nephew relationship will not be contradicted. And any expectation Charles Edward will improve his attitude to meet Uncle William's satisfaction is far-fetched. Consider, at the end of the month, on the 28th, Charles Edward goes to Mr. Crane's store to pick up an order for Ed. Gallinen, a duty we surmise for a neighbor. He notes that the bulk weight of the order was 54 pounds, and adds, "Pretty heavy load for a small boy," a bit of ironic acceptance in those humorous words. But to follow Uncle William's demand, would Charles Edward carry that heavy load with a cheerful countenance, a smile on his face? If he is struggling with the load, his face wouldn't show alacrity. Charles Edward's remark about a heavy load for a small boy raises the question of his height. We have a group photograph of him and his 5 brothers. He and 2 others are seated. The other 3 stand behind. William Pliny, his older dentist brother, is seated and his head is higher than Charles Edward's. They sit on similar chairs. We know from a document about William Pliny's Civil War experience that he was 5 feet, 8 inches tall. That suggests Charles Edward at age 17 was shorter, possibly 5 feet, 6 inches. Without a doubt, 54 pounds is a heavy load for one that height. What he lacked in stature, he must have made up for in muscular strength. If we are in any doubt about how Charles Edward felt about his uncle's imperious demand, we have the entry for the next day, the 18th. He gained a severe headache. He had no physical injury, so reasonably it was a psychosomatic reaction to his uncle's harsh words of the day before. That his uncle's animosity affects him deeply is shown by entries for the next 6 days, through the 23rd. All mention not feeling well. If the second half of February didn't start well for Charles Edward, he gains some solace in seeing the worst of winter weather gone. The Mississippi River has broken up and is open to Alton, or about 30 miles north, upriver. The sight of more river traffic must encourage his spirits when out walking. On the 27th, he notes river open and hardly any ice floating. Went walking on the levee, counted from 20 to 30 steamers just come out of winter quarters. Indeed, movement is in the air, and Charles Edward notes that Mr. and Mrs. Hand will be leaving for Dahlonega. He apparently spelling phonetically the name of present-day Dahlonega, Georgia. And with characteristic precision, he writes on Thursday the 20th, Mr. and Mrs. Hand and little Charlie left for Georgia at 2 o'clock. Traveling several hundred miles would justify the extended stay with relatives. The Hands apparently stayed with Almira Crane Hand's brother, Francis Crane, and his wife, Sarah. Almira Crane Hand was also the sister of Evelina Crane Dickinson. So she, Mr. Hand, and their son, Charlie, had relatives in 2 St. Louis households to call on. Although Charlie Hand probably spent much of his time at the Dickinsons, where, as a 2-year-old, he'd have the company of his 6-year-old cousin, Lily Dickinson. For Charles Edward, being in Uncle William's house, where the latter also had his medical practice office, was sometimes a pressure cooker. It was the 3rd week of February, when he felt unwell every day. But he did have ways to let off the pressure, which included criticism for his apparent attitude toward chores and duties. He could, paradoxically, do his chores. Activity and moving large muscles while splitting wood, for example, is a well-known way to blow off steam. But it doesn't always go that way. On Saturday the 22nd, he was splitting kindling and other minor jobs, when he commenced to feel unwell, and with characteristic understatement notes, stopped operations for the day. Charles Edward has other ways besides chores to get out from under his uncle's thumb, so to speak. He's in St. Louis to go to school, and that takes up enough of his day, combined with walking to and from school, that he often has to do chores first thing in the morning. We have reason to think he enjoys school and wants to make sure he gets the most out of it. On Monday the 24th, he notes that he stayed after school to understand a concept in philosophy, science, he didn't get the first time. He wanted to know the rule for determining the specific gravity of a body that will not sink in water. For an object that floats, the weight of the displaced water is divided into the object's weight. The resulting specific gravity figure is always a fraction less 1.0, which is water's specific gravity. For some objects, like a ship, it might not be a figure easily calculated in practice. Still, this non-trivial concept from physics shows Charles Edward's keen interest in analytical thinking and the underpinnings of how things work. Another important activity that took Charles Edward out of the house was church events. Sunday school, sermons, teaching at Biddle Street Mission, and youth prayer meetings midweek. All approved, we might safely assume, by his uncle and aunt, plus he sincerely admired Dr. Post, his reverend. But beyond school and church, Charles Edward found refuge away from the house and a way to calm his mind by walking. For his entry of Saturday the 29th, he notes he didn't have much to do. That is, chores. So he walked most of the day. He takes delight in seeing the approach of spring, ice breaking up on the Mississippi and ships moving about again. Saw a great many steamers placarded for the different rivers, Ills, Ohio Mo, New Orleans. Business seems brisk on the levee. All these steamers are leaving St. Charles. Edward might be projecting a wish to leave too. We don't know yet, but obviously walking gives him comfort and solace in his time away from the house. Even if the wind blew pretty cold while on the levee, clouds of dust, actual dust, arose thick enough to choke a person, but I survived them, arrived home not the worse for wear. So he takes his time out walking as both the challenge of being in the elements, which often weren't, as he would like, very pleasant, and as a boost to his spirits when he sees steamers on the river sloughing off the inactivity of winter. With the second term underway, it might be a good time to pause and consider where Charles Edward fit into the scheme of education at the academy. It is telling that he drops Latin after the first term, not continuing with the second term. Dropping Latin, plus not taking any Greek, suggests Charles Edward had decided against collegiate studies at the university or any other college. In 1868, admission to the university collegiate studies required a solid background in the classics. That is, Latin and Greek language and literature, often in the source language. Most likely, in the first term, Charles Edward might have still considered collegiate studies. His diary entry for January 10th, which is in the first term, supports that. It states our class, second academic, and the commercial had a spelling match. But as the second term begins, Charles Edward made a switch from the second academic class to the commercial class at the academy. This is confirmed by the Washington University Catalog for the academic year 1867 to 1868, 6, that shows Charles Edward Dickinson, with a residence of Dubuque, Iowa, listed in the commercial class along with two others he tutored in spelling, Samuel O. Kopp and Charles Hall Lamerix. Those in the commercial class were usually preparing for a business career or professional studies not found in the collegiate or scientific departments of the university. And though a member of the commercial class, Charles Edward might attend some classes with students in the academic and preparatory scientific classes. One thing to keep in mind is college in the mid-1800s was unlike college today. It was less affordable for most. Room and board while not working was a big expense. Because much of the U.S. population was still engaged in farming and rural occupations, it was a luxury for a young person to go off to college. Moreover, the emphasis on a classical education as a prerequisite meant studying Latin and Greek for years. Studying these dead languages was important for scholars who read old texts, especially Bible scholars. Many of the first college graduates in America became ministers, as did Charles Edward's grandfather, Pliny, a graduate of Dartmouth. Nonetheless, the 1860s saw change come to the character of colleges, helped specifically by the creation of land-grant colleges, beginning with the Morrill Act of 1862. So though at this time we don't know Charles Edward's career ambitions, we can reasonably rule out collegiate studies. His father, George Lyman, did not go to college. He left the Walpole Academy at age 12, and he was an entrepreneur. In 1868, he owned and operated the 72-room Tremont House in Dubuque, and also was an agent for the Protection Life Insurance Company of Chicago. It's also obvious Charles Edward admired his older brother William Pliny, a practicing dentist. Although we'd call William Pliny a professional, He did not go to college. He went from high school into the Civil War as a private, later promoted to major. After being mustered out, he apprenticed to a dentist in Dubuque, then had a dental partnership in Joliet, Illinois. It's reasonable Charles Edward, with the examples of his father and brother, realized his future had a variety of opportunity. Although there was a tradition of college education in the Dickinson family, he must have foreseen other paths for his life's career, which might not be apparent today, when the college degree has largely supplanted the high school diploma. In sum, Charles Edward's choice of courses for his second term was in line with pursuing a good education at the exclusive academy, but without the required Latin or Greek for collegiate studies. Chapter 9 Chapter 9 Sunday, March 1, 1868 arose at 5:45. Attended SS Church. Afternoon attended B. SS 9 scholars present 47 verses committed recited. Morrison asked me to get the residences of any scholars visit them, but I find that there are others who are just as able to do as I and do not, so I think I will make an excuse of all time occupied during the week with school studies. Weather not very pleasant. Had quite a little rainstorm about 4 p.m. Monday. 2 arose at 6 o'clock. At school philosophy did not go off well, so stayed after school. Had quite a snowstorm last night. It kept me busy for about an hour sweeping it off from the porches and sidewalk. Went to the carpenter shop for a basket of shavings. Weather very cold. Tuesday. 3 arose at 6. At school Mr. Stone took up all the class time in trying to get someone who could explain the gridiron pendulum. He did not succeed. Received a letter from home, one from W. Answered the one from father. Got a basket of shavings. Filled up the barrels. Weather pretty cold for time of year here. Saturday, March 4, 1868 arose at 6. Weather tolerably cool. A school as usual. Nothing especially worthy of note happened today. Thursday. 5 arose at 5:30. Set my fire, got my work all finished before 6 o'clock. This morning Mr. Arnold gave us a problem in partial payments. I worked on it 1.5 hours in school and 4 out and did not get it within 2 CTS. Friday. 6 arose at 6 o'clock. A school as usual. After school went out to Milkman's on Grand Avenue for buttermilk, 1 gallon, and left 1/2 at Doctor. Worked a good while on an example in partial payments. Attended pray meeting. Afterwards with Joe Lathrop Henry Mack went to hear the St. Louis Institute Brass Band play, and they discoursed some very fair music. Weather moderate. Saturday, March 7, 1868 arose at 6. Did not have much to do, only to split kindling and stop up a rat hole in the backyard, which I think I did effectually. Worked all of the afternoon on an example in partial payments, could not come nearer than 56 CTS, took a short walk between 5-6 o'clock p.m. After supper went down to the Mercantile Library rooms with Mr. Guild, spent a very pleasant evening. Weather milder. Sunday. 8 arose at 6:15. Attended SS Church. Post-preach on a text from the 12th chapter of Daniel. Just before church a couple of newsboys got to showing of their pugilistic qualities in earnest, had the pleasure of being lodged in the police station. Such is life. In the afternoon saw a man who had fallen from the streetcars and jammed his head. A policeman asked him what was the matter. He said, "Oh, I only got on a tight, pleasant." Monday. 9 arose at 6:30. A school as usual. Lessons all went off well. Aunt uncle were to entertain Wendell Phillips tomorrow, but came to find out he had been here, delivered his lecture, gone. Did not go to prayer meeting. Weather rainy all day. Tuesday, March 10, 1868 arose at 6. School lessons went off very well. Weather stormy. Went to Horden-Taller Company for a spool of 70 cotton thread for Auntie. RECD a letter from home. The ice at Dubuque floated down about 150 feet on the 8th and the river rose several. Will is going home sometime this week. Wednesday. 11 arose at 6. A school as usual. Rained pretty near all day. Consequently not anything extraordinary was performed by myself. Went to prayer meeting. Cleared off this evening and pleasant. Thursday. 12 arose at 5:30. A school as usual. Lessons all went off well. Weather very pleasant all day. This evening Aunt Uncle gave an informal party at which I made some valuable acquaintances. Had a very pleasant time indeed. Henry Mack and Fred Weslizinus were there. Made the acquaintance of Mr. Dodd of Dodd, Brown Company, dry goods jobbers. Friday, March 13, 1868 arose at 5:30. At school Mr. Stone did not go very hard on us at our philosophy class as he took up most of the time explaining resultant motion. Went on board the low Preshore steamer, Great Republic, the largest steamer on the Mississippi, finally finished furnished. Plying between St. Louis, New Orleans. No ice in the river but is gorged at Rock Island, Davenport. Attended prayer meeting. Saturday 14 arose at 6 o'clock. Took off the coverings of the steps and yard windows. Split kindlings. Filled water barrels, stopped up 2 rat holes. Studied some after dinner, then collected some bills for Uncle William, 85. First for him. Went down to see the Great Republic go out but was disappointed. Sunday 15 arose at 6. Attended SS and church. Heard a sermon by a Methodist minister, attending the convention here, in the morning and from another in the evening. My class at B. SS of 5-2 only having verses recited 82 139, the other 43. Weather very pleasant indeed, more like summer than spring. Chapter 10 Chapter 10. The diary entries for the first half of March have details about Charles Edward's arithmetic class that deserve special discussion. The entry for March 5th is as follows. This morning Mr. Arnold gave us a problem in partial payments. I worked on it 1.5 hours in school and 4 out and did not get within 2 CTS. Then 2 days later, the 7th. Worked all of the afternoon on partial payments, could not come nearer than 56 CTS. Up to now, everything we've read in the diary suggests Charles Edward has a facility with numbers. He precisely notes quantities, temperature, sometimes even writing them in both word and figure style, 2-2, for example. If he is spending hours on one problem from his new Felter's arithmetic, is he in trouble? Is he in danger of flunking the class, or even flunking out of the academy? And yet I couldn't rashly jump to any such conclusion. Not until I saw the problem in partial payments with the same eyes at great-grandfather. I took this on as a challenge I felt more than qualified to tackle. I have an MBA in finance. I've taken Society of Actuaries exams. A partial payment problem, even one from 150 years ago, shouldn't be that hard to comprehend. Stoddard A. Felter A.M. was an American educator who wrote a series of popular textbooks used in public and private schools at the pre-college level. I searched his textbooks, 1868 and earlier, for partial payment problems and believe his The Analysis of Written Arithmetic, Book 2nd, 1864, has problems similar to the one on which Charles Edward labored long hours. Moreover, he bought his textbook secondhand, so an 1864 edition might be his textbook, 28. Felter defines a partial payment as a payment in part of the amount due on a note, bond, or other debt obligation. But before giving problems, Felter lays out a ruling from the U.S. Supreme Court that applies to partial payments for the 37 states in 1864, except Connecticut and New Hampshire, which use slightly different rules given by their respective state Supreme Courts. The rule states that a partial payment will reduce the principal of the debt obligation only if it exceeds the accrued interest from issue date. If not, partial payment is less than accrued interest, then take no notice of it and carry it forward until other payments are made. Wanting to know what it was like for Charles Edward to work out such a problem, I selected the following from Felter's 1864 textbook. A loan is made on January 1, 1858. It is in the amount of $369.84. Assume an interest of 6.0 simple annual. 6 partial payments are made on 6 different dates as follows. June 13, 1858, 50. December 11, 1858, 60. September 13, 1859, 60. July 9, 1860, 120. August 13, 1862, 15. December 29, 1862, 89. What will remain due January 9, 1863, 5 years and 8 days after issue. This is a messy problem because it has a series of linked calculations. Starting with the first partial payment, I calculated how many days had gone by on the loan. I assumed a 30-day month and a 360-day year, which was standard banker practice at the time. Felter states this assumption elsewhere in his textbook. Then I multiplied 6% interest by the year fraction. The resultant interest fraction was applied to the original loan amount of 369.84. The accrued interest to date was less than 50, so I could subtract the difference for an amount to reduce the principal. Then I could take up the second partial payment. In all, I probably spent most of an hour working out all 6 of the partial payments to get a remainder due on January 9, 1863. I plowed through the calculations using a basic 4-function calculator. My answer was 41 cents off what Felter gave as the solution of 82.241. I wasn't especially upset I didn't hit the textbook answer on the penny, though Charles Edward appears to have thought he should have. For one thing, doing all that chained arithmetic can lead to a buildup of calculation rounding errors, depending on how many places past the decimal point you calculate intermediate results. Felter doesn't specify how to do this and gives an answer that is not in whole sense. My 4-function calculator carries numbers 6 and 7 places to the right of the decimal. Then it hit me. In 1868, electronic calculators, electric calculators, or mechanical calculators did not exist. Charles Edward was doing his calculations by hand. He was dividing 162 days into 360 days by long division. That task for us 150 years later seems like pure drudgery. But Charles Edward had no other way of doing the problem except straight-ahead hand calculation. That alone explained why he spent hours on one problem. So although Charles Edward talks about spending all afternoon on a problem, I have a fresh understanding of his calculation handicap. Rather than seeing him as a bumbler in his new Felter's arithmetic class, my solving a problem much like his with the help of a 4-function calculator gave me an unshakable appreciation of his persistence. Anyone who can spend hours working out a finance problem, doing calculation after calculation by hand, has bulldog tenacity. Several entries highlight the importance Charles Edward gives to doing well at school. On Sunday, March 1st, presumably after teaching his Sunday school class at Biddle Street Mission, he is approached by Mr. Morrison, who suggests he get the residences of any scholars' young women students in his Sunday school class and visit them, but I find there are others who are just as able to do so as I and do not. So I think I will make an excuse of all time occupied during the week with school studies. Charles Edward was happy to teach Sunday school, but balked at adding proselytizing to his duties too. And though it's a convenient excuse, pleading schoolwork, it's still true he's dedicated to succeeding at school. The next day, he notes, at school philosophy did not go off so well, so stayed after school. Presumably, he wanted more explanation from Mr. Stone on a natural philosophy topic. One of those topics is brought up the next day. Stone cannot get anyone in class to explain how the gridiron pendulum works. This is a mechanism from the 1800s utterly foreign to us. Its time had come and gone. It was a solution to the problem of thermal expansion in the length of a clock's pendulum, which affected accuracy. The gridiron pendulum had 2 rods, side by side, one of iron, one of zinc, whose thermal expansion properties differed such that they counterbalanced each other. This gave a more constant length for the pendulum and improved the clock's accuracy. It's not surprising, however, Mr. Stone did not succeed and had no takers. Away from school, during his free time, Charles Edward hints at his yearning to travel. On Friday the 13th, he is walking down by the river and sees the largest steamer on the Mississippi, which is the Great Republic. As he notes, its voyages take it back and forth on the Mississippi River, plying between St. Louis, New Orleans. His interest in this steamer, and where it might travel, brings him to go aboard. What he sees is finely finished and furnished. His attraction to the steamer was such that he returned the next day, a Saturday, to see it go out, but was disappointed. Charles Edward must have been late to see the Great Republic leave St. Louis because earlier he'd been on an errand for Uncle William, collecting bills for 85. That amount is substantial, if not in today's dollars, because it's payment for professional services of an eye doctor. Yet despite the chores and errands that go with living in Uncle William's house, Charles Edward enjoys a few household privileges. One is Uncle William's membership in the nearby Mercantile Library, a block away down Locust Street. This is a private, subscription-only library. On Saturday the 7th, he goes to the Mercantile Library with a Mr. Guild, who is evidently an older house guest visiting St. Louis for some reason not given in the diary. The two go to one of the library rooms, which must have been well furnished, and they spent a very pleasant evening. Other social occasions come up during these 2 weeks, and one is the evening of Friday the 6th, when he accompanies his friends Joseph Lathrop and Henry Mack to hear the St. Louis Institute Brass Band play. As he genteelly puts it, they discoursed some very fair music. Another instance of how Charles Edward characteristically expresses himself is the entry for Sunday the 8th, when just before church a couple of newsboys got to showing off their pugilistic qualities in earnest, had the pleasure of being lodged in the police station. Then he adds with ironic detachment, "Such is life." Over and over, the reader has the impression Charles Edward enjoys socializing with people, both new and familiar. On Thursday the 12th, his uncle and aunt give a party at which he makes some valuable acquaintances. Specifically, Mr. Dodd of Dodd, Brown Company, dry goods jobbers. That his friends Henry Mack and Fred Wislezinus were also there only added to this very pleasant time indeed. Despite admitting some of his schoolwork required extra time, staying after class to clarify a philosophy topic and involved calculations for partial payment problems, Charles Edward's 2 weeks end positively with comment, more than once in the second week, that lessons were going over very well. It's also a boost to his spirits that the weather is on the upswing, with winter storminess in retreat. Ice in the river is melting, temperatures are climbing, and Charles Edward does more outside chores around the house with spring in the offing and seasonal cleaning inevitable. As has been noted earlier, Charles Edward eagerly anticipates letters from his older brother William Pliny. The bond between the brothers differs from what he might feel for his 3 younger brothers at home. William Pliny has made the transition to adulthood and doubtless serves as a guide for Charles Edward's own future. So it's of interest on March 10th. He receives a letter from home which he summarizes, "Bro, Will is going home sometime this week." That is a bit of a puzzle until one learns, from other sources, brother William is not in Dubuque, but in Joliet, Illinois, and was returning to Dubuque. Whereas Charles Edward was too young to fight in the Civil War, age 10 at its onset, William Pliny was the perfect age for new recruits when at the age of 18, and in his last year of high school, the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter April 12, 1861. 11 days later, William Pliny left school and was mustered in as a private in the 1st Iowa Infantry. Expectations at the time were the Southern uprising would soon collapse, so the 1st Iowa Infantry and Private William Pliny were mustered out 90 days later. He went back to Dubuque to work as a hotel clerk in his father's Tremont house for the next year. In August 1862, he volunteered again and became part of Company H of what would be Iowa's 21st Regiment. The Civil War continued, and Private William Pliny was soon promoted to Sergeant Major, mostly because of his military experience of 90 days in 1861. Iowa's 21st saw a fair amount of action over the next 12 months, and on May 22, 1863, William Pliny was wounded in battle with injuries to his right shoulder and back. His recovery was slow and he did not return to action. By the end of the year, he was discharged from military duty and returned to Dubuque, where he married Mary Lee Jones on April 11, 1864. The next month, he began studying dentistry as Dr. Clark's assistant in Dubuque. This began a lifelong dedication to dentistry, and he read on his own every book he could buy or borrow on the subject. After a year, in May 1865, William Pliny opened his dental practice in Charles City, several hundred miles from Dubuque in north-central Iowa. In the 1860s, professional education to practice dentistry was not well established. For William Pliny, apprenticing to a practicing dentist, Dr. Clark, was enough to hang out his shingle. So as William Pliny set out on his career, Charles Edward could see college was not needed to have a profession. The practice in Charles City was short-lived, however, as William Pliny's wife, Mary Lee Jones, died 3 days after giving birth to an infant son on July 9, 1866. The infant son also died a few months after that. An interesting and touching insight into how much Charles Edward appreciated familial bonds is shown by looking ahead to his birthday reminder for September 27, 1868. Sister Mary would have been 28 years today. Died July 12th/66. Born September 27/40". He uses sister, not sister-in-law, which is more defining, if colder and formal. Calling his older brother's wife sister shows how completely he accepted Mary Lee Jones into the Dickinson family and, moreover, honors her after her death. In 1866, after Mary's death, William Pliny, despondent about continuing in Charles City, sold his practice and moved north to Joliet, Illinois. His dental practice there was a partnership with another dentist, but only for a year. In the spring of 1868, as Charles Edward notes in the diary, his older brother is coming back to Dubuque to practice dentistry. Charles Edward won't see Bro. Will until he leaves St. Louis during the summer break. But at least he knows he'll see more of him than he did during the years of the Civil War and dental practice away from Dubuque. Another feature of the entries for the first half of March is an accounting for all the chores Charles Edward undertakes. It is as if he takes special care to account for himself, that he responsibly carries out the duties that come with staying at his uncle and aunt's. It snowed heavily on March 2nd. So he notes, "It kept me busy for about an hour sweeping it off the porches and sidewalk." Each day's entry has the same methodical listing of what he did that day. And when he doesn't have chores to do on a particular day, he writes almost apologetically, "Nothing especially worthy of note happened today, as on the 4th or on the 11th. Rained pretty near all day. Consequently not anything extraordinary was performed by myself." A bit of mocking, ironic understatement. Entries for these 2 weeks of March also detail the central importance of religion to Charles Edward. On the 15th, a Sunday, he not only attends Sunday school in the morning, but he also hears a sermon by a visiting Methodist minister, who likely attended the Convention of Protestant Ministers in St. Louis that week. Post-church is congregational, so having a guest minister from another denomination shows an ecumenical spirit. Then, after teaching his Sunday school class at Biddle Street Mission, Charles Edward returns to church in the evening to hear a sermon by yet another minister visiting St. Louis for the convention. In one way or another, most of his waking hours on this particular Sunday were spent in church. As the 15th of March rolls by, Charles Edward must sense fairer. Pleasant weather is on the way. Will spring, days away, continue to lift his spirits, helping him mull over the possibilities once he finishes his schooling at the academy? He looks forward to being with his brother William Pliny again, whose letters he anticipates, and with whom he might go over some of his plans. If there's a concern about how things are going, it's surely the sporadic friction and chiding from his Uncle William. Why that is so, we don't know. Charles Edward doesn't give enough clues about his uncle's behavior. His uncle's presumption of a parental role toward his nephew must at times feel needless. Stay tuned for Part 2. Please subscribe. US.